In the winter of 1919, London was a city struggling to breathe again. The Great War had ended less than a year earlier, leaving millions dead, entire neighborhoods scarred, and a population teetering between relief and exhaustion. Soldiers returned home carrying not only the visible wounds of battle but invisible ones as well, psychological trauma that no doctor could yet fully understand. London streets, slick with rain and fog, were haunted by the ghosts of the past, but something entirely new had begun to haunt its living residents. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. Reports began to trickle in from neighborhoods across the city. A strange, eerie whistling, sometimes faint, sometimes piercing, heard in alleyways, in homes, and even within the walls of hospitals. People described it as unnatural, a sound that seemed to echo directly inside the mind rather than merely the ears. The first reports were dismissed as imagination, the product of nerves frayed by war and the lingering shadow of the Spanish flu, which had claimed countless lives in the previous year. But then the incidents began to escalate. Victims would suddenly clutch their heads, eyes widening in panic, before collapsing to the ground. Some described hearing the whistle before a wave of dizziness overtook them, while others reported seeing faint lights or shadows accompanying the sound. Children would awaken screaming in the middle of the night, certain that some invisible presence had entered their homes. Factory workers fainted en masse on the shop floors, leaving machinery unattended and chaos in their wake. In a city still reeling from one epidemic, the whistling episodes triggered terror of an entirely different kind, an invisible, auditory plague that seemed impossible to contain. The phenomenon earned a chilling nickname in whispers and newspapers alike, the whistling epidemic. It was not a disease in the conventional sense. There were no bacteria or viruses to identify, no clear path of infection. It spread unpredictably, targeting men, women, and children seemingly at random, though patterns began to emerge in proximity and timing. The more people spoke of it, the more it spread, not physically, but psychologically. Fear itself seemed contagious, amplifying the panic with every new report. What made this epidemic so particularly haunting was its intangible nature. Unlike influenza or typhoid, which left visible symptoms or signs of infection, this affliction left only disarray in its wake, collapsing victims, panicked crowds, and a citywide anxiety that hung in the fog like a second London smog. Hospitals were filled not with feverish patients, but with the dizzy, the fainting, and the hysterical. Doctors, already exhausted from tending to war injuries and the remnants of the flu pandemic, found themselves confronting something they could neither measure nor predict. For some, it was a neurological puzzle. For others, it was the creeping touch of madness itself. The media, sensing the macabre fascination the public had with the unexplained, sensationalized the events. Headlines warned of invisible terrors, and newspapers printed the harrowing testimonies of witnesses who claimed to have heard the whistling seconds before losing consciousness. Yet, despite the growing attention, no definitive explanation could be provided. Letters poured into hospitals and police stations, citizens begging for guidance, doctors offering cautious speculation, and the general populace growing more fearful with every passing day. This is the story of London's most mysterious post-war epidemic, a case that blurred the lines between medical anomaly, mass hysteria, and urban legend. Over the course of the following months, entire neighborhoods would be gripped by fear, hospitals would be pushed beyond capacity, and the boundaries of science and superstition would collide in ways that left the city questioning its own sanity. It is a tale of invisible sounds and tangible terror, of a society still recovering from one catastrophe only to face an entirely different kind of menace. As we journey through this dark chapter of history, we will explore the first sightings, the medical examinations, the strange and chilling symptoms, and the modern theories that attempt to explain why Londoners heard a whistle echoing in their streets and collapsing minds. Was it merely a psychological epidemic, the aftershock of a traumatized population? Or was there something more sinister lurking in the foggy alleys of post-war London? By the end of this exploration, the whistling epidemic will reveal not only the fragility of the human mind under collective stress but also the enduring power of fear to shape reality itself. London of 1919, a city scarred by war, disease, and social upheaval, serves as the perfect stage for a mystery that is both historical and eerily relevant, a case where the line between the known and the unknowable fades, leaving only the echo of that haunting whistle in the streets. By the beginning of 1919, London was a city both alive and haunted. The Great War had ended, but its scars were everywhere. Streets once vibrant with commerce were now lined with blackened buildings and shuttered shops. Soldiers returned home bearing the invisible wounds of trench warfare, shell shock, grief, and memories that refused to fade. Families mourned loved ones whose names were etched on monuments and lists, yet their absence lingered in quiet corners of every household. The city's population, already stressed by wartime shortages and overcrowding, teetered on the edge of exhaustion. The Spanish flu had only recently subsided, leaving tens of thousands dead in London alone. Hospitals, already strained by the war, had been overwhelmed by fevered patients coughing through the night. Many families lost multiple members, creating a collective trauma that would resonate through the city for years. Social norms had frayed under the pressure of loss, scarcity, and fear. Londoners walked the streets wary of contagion, anxious at the slightest cough, and suspicious of anyone who appeared different or unwell. In such an environment, even a whisper of something strange could ignite widespread panic. Daily life in 1919 was a careful balance of necessity and caution. Rationing was still in effect, bread lines stretched down streets, coal for heating was limited, and families crowded into small apartments where the damp London fog seeped through walls and windows. The psychological toll of the war and flu was compounded by economic uncertainty. Jobs were scarce, and returning soldiers often found themselves displaced or marginalized. Fear and anxiety were not only pervasive, they were almost expected. Amidst this backdrop, reports of the whistling phenomenon began to resonate with a population already on edge. When a society has been stretched to the breaking point, it becomes more susceptible to collective anxiety, and every shadow or sound can be interpreted as a threat. The whistling was not merely an auditory oddity. It became a symbol of all that was unstable in post-war London. People began to perceive danger in ordinary noises: the creak of a floorboard, the whistle of a passing train, even the laughter of children in the park. Every sound had the potential to trigger panic. This climate of tension also meant that official attempts to explain unusual occurrences were met with both relief and skepticism. Citizens distrusted bureaucratic reassurances, having lived through government failures in wartime mobilization, rationing, and public health crises. When reports of fainting, dizziness, and hallucinations began to surface alongside accounts of the mysterious whistling, many Londoners assumed the worst. The city's collective imagination, already primed by grief and fear, added layers of interpretation: ghosts, curses, or secret wartime experiments. In other words, the mental state of Londoners amplified the epidemic itself, turning whispers into widespread terror. At the same time, medical understanding of psychological trauma and neurological conditions was rudimentary. Shell shock had only recently been recognized as a condition affecting returning soldiers, and the general population had little comprehension of the link between stress, illness, and collective hysteria. Physicians could treat symptoms but often lacked the tools to address the root causes, especially when those causes were invisible and seemingly everywhere. The boundaries between physical illness, mental stress, and social anxiety were blurred, leaving Londoners vulnerable to phenomena that might otherwise have been dismissed. In addition to societal tension, London's urban environment itself played a role. Narrow alleys, fog-shrouded streets, and overcrowded tenements created a sense of confinement. People could hear strange noises echoing through the city with eerie clarity, and in the dense, humid fog, sound seemed amplified, warped, and omnipresent. The architecture and climate conspired to make ordinary events feel uncanny, and the whistling, wherever it appeared, seemed to resonate directly with the psyche of the city. By situating the whistling epidemic within this context, it becomes clear that it was more than a simple medical mystery. It was a phenomenon deeply intertwined with social conditions, psychological fragility, and the collective memory of trauma. London was a city exhausted, grieving, and hypersensitive, an ideal environment for fear itself to take on a tangible form. This is why the epidemic, though scientifically mysterious, left an indelible mark on the city and its people. As the whistling began to spread, it encountered a population primed for terror, a society whose very atmosphere seemed to magnify the strange and inexplicable. In such a city, even the faintest sound could become a harbinger of panic. Understanding London in 1919 is essential to understanding why the whistling epidemic gripped the imagination and bodies of its residents so completely, and why no ordinary explanation could satisfy a city so haunted by war, disease, and uncertainty. The first reports of the whistling phenomenon were almost anecdotal, dismissed by many as coincidence or overactive imaginations. Yet, as the months progressed into early 1919, it became clear that something extraordinary and deeply unsettling was unfolding. Witnesses described hearing a high-pitched, eerie whistle that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was unlike any sound they had encountered before, not the whistle of a train, the call of a bird, or the wind through chimneys, but something that pierced the mind rather than the ear. In alleys, markets, and factories, the sound was followed by sudden dizziness, pallor, and fainting. In some cases, those affected claimed they saw shadows or fleeting lights in conjunction with the whistling, though these details varied from person to person. One of the earliest documented cases occurred in the East End, a densely packed neighborhood where families lived in cramped apartments above bustling shops. A local newspaper reported that a young girl named Elsie had been walking home from school when she suddenly collapsed, clutching her head and screaming about a whistle in the air. Her mother rushed to her side, but by the time she arrived, Elsie was pale and trembling, unable to speak coherently. Within days, several children in the same district experienced similar episodes, all describing the same unearthly sound that seemed to precede their collapse. These isolated cases were the first signs of what would soon become a citywide panic. In factories and warehouses, the whistling became particularly alarming. Workers operating heavy machinery would suddenly freeze, their hands dropping tools, eyes wide in terror, and colleagues rushing to assist. In one documented incident at a textile mill in Hackney, nearly a dozen employees fainted within minutes of hearing the whistle. Supervisors were baffled, the machines continued running unattended, the whistling continued, and fear spread faster than the sound itself. Factory owners appealed to local authorities for explanations, but medical professionals were perplexed. No toxin, no chemical exposure, and no infection could account for the phenomenon. Hospitals began receiving cases with increasing regularity. Victims arrived with similar complaints: dizziness, fainting, nausea, and the inexplicable perception of whistling. Doctors initially treated these as post-flu complications or neurological aftereffects from wartime trauma. Yet the consistency of the reports, the shared auditory element, the sudden onset, the rapid spread, suggested something beyond ordinary illness. Some physicians even noted that entire families could be affected within days, though the episodes did not always coincide physically. One parent might hear the whistle in a kitchen while a child fainted miles away, implying a psychological or environmental component that science at the time could not explain. By March 1919, newspapers began publishing increasingly alarming accounts. Letters from readers described the whistle as a sound that crawls under your skin or a tone that speaks directly to the mind. Local reporters documented incidents on the streets, from market squares to narrow alleys, emphasizing the randomness of the occurrences. In one particularly chilling account, a man walking along the Thames described hearing a whistle echoing across the fog-laden river. Moments later, he collapsed, his eyes rolling back in fear. When he awoke hours later in a hospital bed, he claimed the sound had been inside his head, not outside. Police records from the time corroborate many of these accounts. Officers reported responding to scenes where multiple individuals had fainted in public spaces, sometimes in succession. Eyewitnesses described crowds forming around victims, some crying out about the whistle, others attempting to flee the area. In several cases, entire neighborhoods experienced panic, with rumors spreading faster than the sound itself. Authorities struggled to maintain order while simultaneously investigating the source of the mysterious auditory phenomenon. Patterns began to emerge. Most incidents occurred in dense urban areas, often during periods of low visibility caused by London's characteristic fog. The victims were of all ages and backgrounds, though there was a notable prevalence among children and women in crowded households. Medical professionals speculated that stress, fatigue, and residual post-war trauma might heighten susceptibility. Yet these explanations did not fully account for the widespread nature of the episodes, nor for the reports of visual disturbances accompanying the whistling. The cumulative effect of these early cases was a growing sense of dread across the city. Londoners, already wary from years of war and influenza, began to perceive the whistle everywhere. Ordinary street sounds, the clatter of a cart, the whistle of a kettle, or the wind through chimneys, were interpreted as ominous signals. The whistling epidemic, initially dismissed as coincidence, had begun to take root in the collective consciousness of the city. It was no longer just an oddity. It was a looming threat, invisible yet omnipresent, capable of triggering both physiological and psychological terror. By the time the first serious investigations were launched, the epidemic had already spread across multiple boroughs. The early cases, seemingly random yet eerily consistent, served as the foundation for a mystery that would grip London for months. The city's population, traumatized and exhausted, was caught between fear and disbelief. What had started as isolated incidents of fainting and dizziness was now a phenomenon that defied explanation, leaving both residents and medical professionals searching for answers in the streets, hospitals, and foggy alleyways of post-war London. As the whistling epidemic spread across London, doctors, nurses, and witnesses began cataloguing the symptoms, but what they observed defied conventional medical understanding. Unlike influenza or other infectious diseases, there was no fever, no rash, and no visible signs of infection. The primary symptom, a sudden, intense auditory perception of a high-pitched whistle, was itself baffling. Victims describe it as a sound that seemed to emanate not from the environment but from within their own heads, striking with sudden intensity, often leaving them disoriented or paralyzed. The earliest observable reaction was dizziness. Victims would suddenly clutch their heads, stumble, or collapse entirely. Some would fall into a deep faint, unconscious for minutes at a time, while others remained semi-conscious, muttering incomprehensible phrases. Nurses in East End hospitals noted that fainting spells were often preceded by an expression of sheer terror, as though the individual were witnessing an invisible horror. Doctors recorded that some patients had dilated pupils, rapid heartbeat, and shallow breathing, yet all these physical signs were secondary to the overarching psychological impact. Hallucinations accompanied many of the episodes. Patients reported seeing flickers of light, shadows moving along walls, or figures appearing at the edges of their vision. One young woman, a resident of Bethnal Green, described a shadowy figure dancing alongside the sound, which she swore had whispered her name. Children, in particular, seemed more susceptible to visual distortions, often screaming at unseen entities or attempting to flee rooms in panic. Some witnesses described auditory layering, where the whistle would alternate with other inexplicable sounds, a low hum, a faint whisper, or an echoing chant. The psychological component was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Victims frequently exhibited acute anxiety, confusion, and temporary amnesia. Some forgot entire stretches of time surrounding the event, while others became obsessed with avoiding the whistle, refusing to leave their homes or walk in crowded streets. Doctors observed that in multiple family cases, one individual's episode could trigger similar reactions in others, suggesting a contagious psychological effect. One midwife recounted a scene where a mother fainted upon hearing her baby's first whistle-like cry, a phenomenon that terrified onlookers and highlighted the intricate interplay between perception, suggestion, and fear. Neurological symptoms were also reported. In some cases, partial paralysis, twitching, or muscle rigidity accompanied fainting spells. Patients occasionally exhibited speech disturbances, stammering, incoherence, or sudden muteness. A small subset experienced nausea, headaches, or visual disturbances such as blurred vision or temporary blindness. These neurological effects were inconsistent, making it difficult for physicians to classify the epidemic under any known disorder. Some speculated that the trauma of war and the residual influenza pandemic could have weakened the nervous system, rendering victims unusually sensitive to environmental stimuli. Doctors at the time began to draw tentative parallels with post-viral neurological disorders, such as encephalitis lethargica, which had afflicted Europe during the 1918 to 1919 period. However, the whistling epidemic did not match the typical profile of such illnesses. Unlike encephalitis lethargica, which had predictable neurological symptoms and a viral origin, the whistling episodes were sudden, unpredictable, and primarily auditory. There was no clear progression or physical deterioration, leaving physicians frustrated and perplexed. Behavioral anomalies added yet another layer of complexity. People affected often displayed erratic conduct before or after an episode. Some would become hyperactive, pacing, screaming, or performing repetitive actions, while others fell into near-catatonic states. In several documented incidents, entire rooms of people appeared to respond to an invisible stimulus. Children cried in unison, women clutched their ears, and men attempted to flee the vicinity. This social contagion effect reinforced the idea that the whistling epidemic was as much psychological as physical, blurring the line between symptom and reaction. Contemporary accounts also describe the epidemic's influence on sleep and appetite. Many victims experienced insomnia, vivid nightmares, and a lingering sense of dread that persisted even after the fainting spell ended. Appetite loss and fatigue were commonly reported, adding to the impression that the epidemic extended beyond moments of collapse. One medical officer noted that the shadow of the whistle remains long after the sound has ceased, capturing the lingering psychological grip on the city's population. Perhaps the most unnerving aspect of the symptoms was their apparent randomness. There was no clear age, gender, or social group that was entirely immune. Children, adults, factory workers, teachers, and homemakers alike fell victim. though the common denominator appeared to be heightened stress and prolonged exposure to urban environments. Crowded streets, fog-laden alleys, and densely populated tenements seemed to exacerbate susceptibility, leading researchers at the time to consider environmental triggers. Yet no definitive pattern could be established, fueling speculation, fear, and confusion. Despite the bewildering array of symptoms, medical professionals sought to establish guidelines for care. Recommendations included isolation from crowds, rest, and avoidance of loud or unusual sounds. Physicians sometimes prescribed sedatives to calm severe anxiety, though these measures were largely palliative rather than curative. Hospitals became places not of treatment but observation, where doctors documented every fainting episode, every hallucination, and every erratic behavior in the hopes of understanding the epidemic's nature. The whistling epidemic, therefore, was not merely an auditory anomaly. It was a complex interplay of neurological, psychological, and social phenomena. It exposed the fragility of the human nervous system under collective stress and highlighted the impact of post-war trauma on perception and behavior. Ordinary Londoners, already living in a state of heightened alert, found themselves at the mercy of an invisible sound that could strike anywhere, at any time. The city itself became a stage for the epidemic, with fog, narrow streets, and overpopulated dwellings amplifying both the sound and the fear it induced. As the epidemic unfolded, it became increasingly clear that understanding the symptoms was only the beginning. Each fainting, hallucination, and behavioral anomaly was a piece of a puzzle that defied conventional medicine. The whistling was more than a sound. It was a phenomenon that challenged the very limits of human perception and resilience, leaving doctors, authorities, and citizens alike searching for answers in the foggy streets of post-war London. As the whistling epidemic spread through London, the city became a hotbed of speculation. People were desperate for answers, and in the absence of a clear medical explanation, theory and superstition collided. Newspapers printed sensational headlines about invisible terrors and ghostly whistles, while citizens whispered about curses, spirits, or clandestine wartime experiments. The epidemic became as much a story of perception as of physiology, revealing the fine line between science and folklore in a society still recovering from war and disease. Medical professionals were among the first to attempt rational explanations. Doctors speculated that the epidemic could be a post-viral neurological disorder, possibly related to the lingering effects of the Spanish flu or encephalitis lethargica, which had swept through Europe in the previous year. They observed similarities in neurological symptoms, fainting, dizziness, hallucinations, but the sudden onset, auditory focus, and mass occurrence remained inexplicable. Some physicians suggested that the whistles were the result of stress-induced neurological hyperactivity, where the brain, overwhelmed by trauma, misinterpreted sensory input and generated phantom sounds. Others proposed environmental factors. Wartime factories, many still operating in 1919, produced chemicals and residues that could affect neurological function. Toxic exposure to solvents, cleaning agents, or even residual munitions chemicals was hypothesized as a potential cause. Certain neighborhoods, particularly industrial districts, reported higher incidences of fainting episodes, lending some credence to this theory. Yet no consistent toxicological evidence could be found. Hospitals examined patients for traces of chemical exposure, but results were inconclusive. The physical environment of London, fog, damp streets, and poor ventilation, was also considered a potential amplifier of auditory phenomena. Yet again, nothing could definitively explain the epidemic. Psychologists and emerging psychiatrists began considering mass psychogenic illness as a possible explanation. Known at the time as epidemic hysteria, this condition suggested that psychological stress could manifest as physical symptoms across a population. London's residents, exhausted by war, disease, and social upheaval, fit the profile of a population susceptible to collective hysteria. Entire families or workforces could faint simultaneously, influenced by fear and suggestion rather than infection. Mass gatherings and crowded neighborhoods amplified this effect, as one person's reaction triggered panic in others. In this framework, the whistle was less a sound and more a symbol of collective anxiety, a psychological contagion with real physical manifestations. Superstition, however, thrived alongside science. Many Londoners turned to folklore and spiritual interpretations. Some believed the whistle was the work of restless souls, echoes of soldiers lost in battle, or spirits unsettled by the recent plague. Others feared secret experiments by the government or munitions factories, imagining that chemical or sonic weapons had been unleashed upon the population. These supernatural theories gained traction in newspapers and letters to editors, fueling widespread fear. Children whispered about the invisible whistler stalking the streets, and adults nervously recounted strange experiences in fog-shrouded alleys. Some contemporary accounts even hinted at conspiracies. A small number of Londoners speculated that returning soldiers, many with shell shock or neurological damage, might inadvertently be producing or amplifying the sound. Others suggested that the whistle could be a side effect of trauma passed through social networks, an auditory manifestation of collective grief and exhaustion. While these ideas were never scientifically validated, they underscore the desperation of a population searching for meaning in an inexplicable crisis. The tension between rationality and superstition was palpable. Hospitals attempted to document cases scientifically, noting symptoms, environmental conditions, and potential triggers. Physicians debated whether to classify the phenomenon as a neurological disorder, a psychological epidemic, or a combination of both. Meanwhile, the press fed public imagination with stories that blurred fact and fiction, often emphasizing the most frightening details. Some papers printed eyewitness accounts of shadows moving in the fog alongside the whistle, while others highlighted entire classrooms or factories collapsing simultaneously. The city was caught between two worlds, one governed by logic and medical observation, the other ruled by fear, rumor, and folklore. Religious leaders occasionally weighed in, interpreting the events as divine judgment or a test of moral resilience. Church sermons referenced invisible forces and the need for repentance, warning parishioners that evil could manifest in subtle, disorienting ways. For many, these spiritual interpretations provided comfort or explanation when science could offer none. The whistling became not just a medical mystery, but a cultural touchstone, reflecting the anxieties, beliefs, and fears of a society struggling to understand its own fragility. Ultimately, no single explanation satisfied both authorities and the public. The whistling epidemic sat at the intersection of medicine, psychology, and superstition, resisting easy classification. Doctors offered cautious hypotheses, scientists probed environmental conditions, and citizens turned to folklore, yet the phenomenon continued to defy understanding. The multiplicity of theories only deepened the sense of uncertainty, leaving Londoners to navigate a city where the invisible could strike at any moment and fear itself became a pervasive force. In this clash between science and superstition, the whistling epidemic revealed more about the society it afflicted than any pathogen or chemical ever could. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a traumatized population, the limits of contemporary medicine, and the powerful interplay between perception and reality. As the epidemic evolved, the city found itself trapped in a cycle where fear amplified the phenomenon, and the phenomenon, in turn, amplified fear, a feedback loop that left both medical professionals and ordinary citizens questioning what was real, what was imagined, and whether the whistle would ever truly stop. As the whistling epidemic continued to sweep across London, experts increasingly debated whether the phenomenon was purely psychological, a case of mass hysteria, or something far more enigmatic. The notion of mass psychogenic illness, though not fully understood in 1919, began to gain traction among psychiatrists and physicians struggling to explain the sudden collapses, hallucinations, and auditory disturbances that defied conventional medicine. Entire neighborhoods, factories, and schools appeared to fall victim in waves, as if the epidemic was spreading not through infection, but through fear itself. Mass hysteria, then commonly referred to as collective nervousness, was not a new concept. Historical accounts documented similar events, from the dancing plagues of medieval Europe to outbreaks of fainting spells in boarding schools and factories. Yet the whistling epidemic presented a unique complexity. Unlike previous cases, it involved an inexplicable auditory stimulus, a high-pitched whistle that no one could locate or verify. Witnesses insisted the sound was real, even when it appeared simultaneously in separate locations, suggesting a phenomenon that was both psychological and environmental, defying the simple models of hysteria known at the time. Sociologists later examined the conditions that may have primed London for such a collective response. The city was densely populated, with crowded streets, tenements, and factories providing ample opportunity for social contagion. Families often lived in multi-generational households, and children shared stories of the whistle with each other, amplifying the fear. Reports indicate that even casual conversation about the phenomenon could trigger anxiety or fainting episodes, creating a feedback loop where awareness of the epidemic became almost as potent a factor as the mysterious sound itself. Children and adolescents were particularly vulnerable. In one documented school incident, several students fainted simultaneously after reporting the whistle in a crowded classroom. Teachers, overwhelmed and unsure of how to respond, attempted to calm the students, but their efforts often proved futile. Panic spread like wildfire, infecting not only the students but also the staff, who became increasingly anxious and fearful of additional episodes. Observers noted that in such environments, a single fainting event could ignite a chain reaction, where fear itself became the trigger. Workplaces were equally susceptible. Factories and warehouses, already stressful environments due to long hours, poor lighting, and heavy labor, became sites where the whistle was particularly disruptive. In Hackney and Shoreditch, multiple cases occurred simultaneously on the production floors. Workers reported hearing the whistle above the clatter of machines, experiencing dizziness, and collapsing before supervisors could intervene. Entire shifts could be incapacitated within minutes, highlighting the social and environmental factors that amplified the epidemic. In these settings, the line between individual psychological vulnerability and collective panic blurred, creating what medical officers described as a synchronized collapse of reason and body. Yet the question remained, was this phenomenon purely psychological, or did it have a physiological origin as well? Some physicians speculated that post-viral neurological damage from influenza or wartime chemical exposure might have heightened susceptibility to auditory hallucinations. Others considered fatigue, malnutrition, and chronic stress as contributing factors. The diversity of symptoms, ranging from fainting to hallucinations, nausea, and temporary paralysis, suggested a multifactorial cause. In other words, the epidemic may have been a convergence of biological vulnerability and social suggestion, a perfect storm of post-war fragility. Reports of auditory perception without an identifiable source puzzled neurologists. Could an invisible sound physically induce fainting and hallucinations, or were these entirely products of the mind? Modern analysis suggests that the phenomenon may have been a combination of environmental triggers and psychological amplification. London's foggy streets, narrow alleys, and damp housing created an eerie sensory landscape. Ordinary noises, the whistle of a train, wind through chimneys, or dripping water, could be misinterpreted or magnified in perception, especially by a population already on edge. Fear, stress, and social suggestion could then transform these ordinary sounds into the terrifying whistle reported across the city. The epidemic also revealed how quickly fear could become contagious. As reports spread, people became hypervigilant, listening for the sound everywhere. Anxiety alone could produce physical symptoms. Dizziness, fainting, and panic attacks were common manifestations of heightened stress. In this way, the whistle became both the cause and the effect, a self-propagating phenomenon. One physician observed, the sound itself may be imaginary, yet the reactions it provokes are painfully real. Despite the predominance of psychological explanations, many Londoners remained convinced that something more sinister was at play. Supernatural interpretations persisted. Spirits of the dead, curses, and otherworldly forces were invoked to make sense of the inexplicable. Others suspected lingering wartime munitions or chemical experiments gone wrong. These beliefs, combined with social and environmental stresses, magnified the epidemic's reach. Fear became a force with physical consequences, capable of incapacitating whole communities. In examining the whistling epidemic, it becomes clear that it existed at the intersection of mind, body, and society. Individual vulnerability, collective anxiety, environmental factors, and post-war trauma all contributed to its intensity and unpredictability. While modern understanding might classify the event primarily as mass psychogenic illness, contemporary witnesses experienced it as a terrifying and tangible reality. It was a phenomenon that challenged the limits of medicine, the understanding of the human mind, and the capacity of a traumatized city to cope with the unknown. Ultimately, the whistling epidemic illustrates how collective stress can manifest in astonishing and terrifying ways. London, exhausted and haunted by the recent past, became a stage upon which the boundaries between reality and perception, science and superstition, mind and body, were irrevocably blurred. Whether entirely psychological or a combination of factors yet unknown, the epidemic left a profound mark on the city, demonstrating the extraordinary power of fear to shape human experience and bend perception in ways that are as fascinating as they are terrifying. As the whistling epidemic intensified, the response from both medical authorities and the government became a race against an invisible and unpredictable threat. Hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of fainting, dizziness, and hallucinations. Doctors worked tirelessly, documenting symptoms, attempting treatments, and reporting patterns to public health officials. Yet the epidemic resisted categorization. Was it a neurological disorder, a psychosomatic condition, or something altogether unknown. This uncertainty created frustration and fear, not just among the public, but within the very institutions tasked with managing the crisis. Hospitals, already stretched thin from the aftermath of the Great War and the lingering effects of the Spanish flu, found themselves facing patients who could not be easily treated. Nurses recounted chaotic wards where fainting spells occurred without warning, sometimes affecting multiple patients simultaneously. In some cases, staff themselves fell victim to the phenomenon, stricken with dizziness or panic while attending to patients. Makeshift observation rooms were established to monitor those affected, but these efforts could do little to prevent new incidents. The medical system was under siege not by a pathogen, but by fear itself, a fear that had physical consequences. Public health officials attempted to investigate the epidemic systematically. Teams of doctors and inspectors were dispatched to neighborhoods reporting the highest incidence of episodes. They conducted interviews, noted environmental conditions, and tried to identify potential triggers. Factories, schools, and crowded housing were closely examined. Authorities looked for chemical exposure, poor ventilation, or post-flu complications, yet no consistent explanation emerged. In some instances, neighborhoods that reported multiple cases were environmentally and socially diverse, further confounding investigators. Every analysis led to more questions, not answers. The government also sought to manage public perception. Newspapers printed warnings and public notices advising calm, yet these efforts often backfired. Sensationalist reporting, accounts of entire classrooms collapsing, workers fainting in factories, and mysterious sounds echoing through foggy streets, heightened anxiety and curiosity in equal measure. Letters poured into city councils and hospitals, as anxious citizens demanded explanations and protection. Authorities had to navigate the fine line between providing reassurance and maintaining credibility in the face of a phenomenon they could not fully explain. Medical boards debated potential classifications. Some physicians leaned toward neurological explanations, citing post-influenza complications or undiagnosed encephalitic conditions. Others emphasized psychological or social factors, pointing to mass hysteria and the cumulative stress of post-war London. A few even suggested environmental causes, such as chemical residues from factories or lingering wartime munitions. Despite the diversity of opinion, no single theory gained universal acceptance, leaving the city's residents with mounting unease. In addition to hospitals, the police were frequently called to manage crowds affected by the whistle. Officers reported scenes of panic, families fleeing streets, groups of children collapsing in unison, and workers abandoning their posts mid-shift. Maintaining order in the midst of such inexplicable events proved challenging. Authorities often had to act more as first responders to manage fear and prevent injury, rather than as investigators of a tangible threat. In many ways, the epidemic had created a new type of urban crisis, one where perception and panic could incapacitate entire communities. Community response also became a crucial part of containment. Neighborhoods tried to shield vulnerable residents, particularly children and the elderly, from exposure to the auditory phenomenon. Families would avoid busy streets, children were kept indoors, and some workplaces temporarily closed to prevent further episodes. Yet, despite these precautions, the epidemic continued its sporadic and unpredictable spread. This unpredictability reinforced the sense that the whistle could strike anywhere, at any time, and that no amount of human intervention could fully control it. Interestingly, some medical professionals used the epidemic as a case study in collective human psychology. Hospitals documented patterns of symptoms, social triggers, and behavioral responses. These records, while incomplete, provided early insight into mass psychogenic illness and the influence of environmental and societal stresses on physical health. However, the lack of a definitive explanation frustrated researchers, highlighting both the limitations of contemporary medicine and the profound mystery that the whistling epidemic represented. Ultimately, the government and medical response to the whistling epidemic illustrates the challenges faced when a society confronts an invisible, poorly understood phenomenon. Authorities had to balance investigation with public reassurance, while hospitals struggled to care for patients whose afflictions defied categorization. The epidemic revealed gaps in knowledge, limitations of institutional control, and the profound psychological vulnerabilities of a population still reeling from war and disease. In confronting the whistling, London faced not just a medical mystery, but a mirror reflecting its own collective anxiety, resilience, and fear. One of the most haunting aspects of the whistling epidemic was the sheer volume of first-hand accounts describing experiences that were simultaneously terrifying and inexplicable. These testimonies provide a chilling glimpse into the psychological and emotional toll of the phenomenon, revealing a city gripped not only by an unknown auditory force but also by the fear it generated. From children to factory workers, from mothers to soldiers returning from war, the whistle seemed to touch every facet of London society. In Bethnal Green, a young mother named Margaret recounted one particularly unsettling incident. She had been putting her children to bed when she heard a piercing whistle that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Her children screamed, clutching their ears, while Margaret's own head began to spin with dizziness. She described an invisible presence moving through the apartment, as if the sound carried a weight beyond the physical. She fainted for several minutes, only to awaken in a state of profound disorientation. This account, published in a local newspaper, became one of the earliest widely circulated examples of the epidemic, highlighting both the auditory and psychological impact. Factory workers offered equally unnerving stories. At a textile mill in Hackney, a group of young women reported hearing the whistle during their shift. Several collapsed in quick succession, leaving machinery running unattended and supervisors scrambling to maintain order. One worker described the whistle as shrill and endless, a sound that crawls into your head and will not let go. Her account, echoed by others in the mill, emphasized the consistency of perception among victims, despite differences in exact location or prior health status. These collective experiences reinforced the idea that the whistle was more than a random hallucination. It was a phenomenon that could trigger mass reaction. Children's experiences were particularly poignant. In a school in Shoreditch, multiple students fainted simultaneously while teachers attempted to conduct lessons. One student, Emily, later recalled seeing shadowy shapes dancing around the classroom while hearing the whistle, describing the sound as both outside and inside my head at the same time. Teachers struggled to calm the students, noting that panic spread like wildfire. One child's fear would ignite another's, and soon the entire classroom was in chaos. These accounts illustrate how social and environmental factors amplified the epidemic, with the whistle serving as both stimulus and symbol of collective anxiety. Soldiers returning from the front also became victims of the whistle, their experiences complicated by lingering war trauma. In one case, a veteran named Thomas reported hearing the whistle in a foggy alley while walking home from work. He collapsed, clutching his head, and upon awakening, insisted that he had seen the specters of fallen comrades marching alongside him. Such testimonies blurred the line between post-traumatic stress and the epidemic itself, suggesting that the whistle could interact with pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities, producing a range of terrifying experiences unique to each individual. Letters to newspapers and hospitals further illuminated the epidemic's reach and variability. One correspondent described fainting while walking through the marketplace, attributing the sound to some terrible experiment or curse. Another wrote of hearing the whistle echo across multiple streets in succession, causing neighbors to collapse in turn. Collectively, these accounts reveal a city struggling to interpret events that defied ordinary explanation, a society in which the boundary between perception and reality had grown dangerously thin. Some witnesses even reported physical phenomena accompanying the whistle. Shadows flickering in peripheral vision, cold drafts with no apparent source, and inexplicable pressure in the head were commonly cited. These sensory distortions reinforced the sense that the epidemic was more than auditory, engaging multiple aspects of human perception. The combination of fear, hallucination, and real physiological response, dizziness, fainting, heart palpitations, created experiences that were both internally generated and externally reinforced, a terrifying synergy of mind and body. In interviews conducted decades later, survivors often recalled the persistent anxiety long after the episode ceased. Many described a lingering fear of unexplained sounds, a hyper-awareness of environmental cues, and difficulty trusting their own senses. Children who experienced the whistle frequently developed phobias, insomnia, and heightened sensitivity to ordinary noises. Adults similarly reported ongoing nervous tension, suggesting that the epidemic's impact extended far beyond immediate fainting spells, leaving psychological scars that would shape the city's collective memory. Eyewitness accounts also underscore the epidemic's randomness. While some neighborhoods experienced clusters of cases, others remained largely unaffected, creating a sense of unpredictability that heightened fear. People never knew when or where the whistle might strike next. The ambiguity fueled rumors, superstitions, and speculative theories, creating a feedback loop in which anticipation and anxiety heightened susceptibility to the phenomenon. In essence, The whistle became a social and psychological contagion, spreading faster than any tangible sound. Taken together, these first-hand accounts provide a vivid, unsettling portrait of London under the influence of the whistling epidemic. They reveal not only the physical and psychological symptoms but also the social dynamics that amplified its impact. Fear became an agent of its own, transforming ordinary streets, schools, and workplaces into sites of terror. Through these voices, the epidemic emerges not merely as a medical mystery, but as a profoundly human story of perception, vulnerability, and the haunting power of the unknown. As the whistling epidemic continued to sweep through London, authorities launched formal investigations to uncover its cause and prevent further panic. Hospitals, medical boards, and public health officials coordinated efforts, sending doctors, inspectors, and researchers into the neighborhoods most affected. They meticulously documented symptoms, environmental conditions, and patient histories, hoping to identify patterns or triggers. Yet, despite exhaustive efforts, answers remained elusive, and each new observation seemed to deepen the mystery rather than clarify it. Medical teams began by cataloging patient reports. Victims described a sudden high-pitched whistle, dizziness, fainting, and in some cases, hallucinations. Doctors took notes on the timing, location, and environmental conditions surrounding each episode, attempting to determine if the phenomenon could be linked to chemical exposure, infectious disease, or neurological damage. Early hypotheses included residual effects from the Spanish flu, post-traumatic stress among returning soldiers, and neurological disorders like encephalitis lethargica. Yet none of these explanations could account for the sheer randomness, rapid spread, and auditory nature of the episodes. Environmental investigations were equally frustrating. Inspectors surveyed factories, tenements, and public spaces, measuring air quality, noise levels, and potential chemical hazards. Factories in East London were scrutinized for chemical residues, ventilation issues, and other occupational hazards that might trigger fainting spells. Investigators explored sewage systems, gas leaks, and structural anomalies in buildings. Although isolated cases revealed poor ventilation or exposure to chemicals, no single environmental factor correlated consistently with the appearance of the whistling phenomenon. Some neighborhoods with similar conditions reported no cases at all, leaving authorities puzzled. Police records added another layer of complexity. Officers responding to incidents found victims scattered across streets, alleyways, and public squares. In several cases, entire groups had collapsed simultaneously, raising questions about whether the epidemic had a physiological or psychological origin, or perhaps both. Witnesses described seeing victims clutch their heads, stumble, or scream about the whistle, reinforcing the impression that fear itself could trigger the physical manifestations. Officers, like doctors, were left with few tools to intervene, often acting merely to keep crowds calm and prevent injury. Public inquiries and correspondence also highlighted the societal dimension of the epidemic. Letters from anxious citizens poured into hospitals, newspapers, and government offices. People demanded explanations and protective measures, while the media, sensing public fascination, amplified the most sensational aspects of the phenomenon. Accounts of entire classrooms collapsing, workers fainting en masse, and shadowy apparitions accompanying the whistle-fueled panic. Authorities faced the dual challenge of investigating the epidemic scientifically while managing public perception, a task complicated by the lack of concrete evidence and the epidemic's intangible nature. Attempts at medical intervention were largely reactive. Hospitals established observation wards to monitor victims and provide supportive care, but there was no known cure or treatment. Sedatives were administered in some cases to calm severe anxiety, while rest and isolation were recommended to prevent additional episodes. Yet, these measures addressed only the symptoms, not the cause. The inability to halt the epidemic contributed to widespread frustration among both medical professionals and the public, further reinforcing the sense that London was under siege by an invisible force. Some investigators explored the possibility of contagious psychological effects, a concept that would later be recognized as mass psychogenic illness. Researchers noted that one person's episode often triggered reactions in nearby individuals, suggesting that observation and suggestion could play a significant role. Entire classrooms, families, and workforces experienced near-simultaneous episodes, yet there was no physical agent to transmit the affliction. This recognition, while providing partial understanding, did little to reassure a population desperate for definitive answers. Despite months of investigation, the whistling epidemic remained unsolved. The randomness of cases, the combination of physical and psychological symptoms, and the absence of any identifiable source left authorities at a dead end. Environmental, medical, and social factors were documented, but no single explanation could account for the phenomenon in its entirety. Reports continued to arrive from new neighborhoods, spreading fear and perpetuating the cycle of observation, reaction, and documentation. The dead ends faced by investigators highlight the limitations of early 20th century science and medicine. Doctors lacked the tools to fully explore neurological and psychological phenomena, and public health systems were unprepared for an epidemic that operated through perception and suggestion rather than bacteria or virus. The whistling epidemic challenged assumptions about disease, contagion, and the human mind, exposing vulnerabilities in both medical understanding and societal resilience. Ultimately, the investigations revealed as much about London itself as about the epidemic. They documented the psychological fragility of a city recovering from war and pandemic, the power of fear to manifest physically, and the difficulty of confronting phenomena that straddle the line between mind and environment. Though no definitive solution was found, the meticulous documentation provided a foundation for later studies in psychology, neurology, and the sociology of mass hysteria, ensuring that the whistling epidemic would not be forgotten even if its cause remained a mystery. Decades after the whistling epidemic gripped London, historians, psychologists, and medical researchers have revisited the case, seeking explanations that were beyond the reach of 1919 investigators. While contemporary doctors struggled with incomplete knowledge and limited tools, modern science allows for a more nuanced understanding, combining insights from neurology, psychology, environmental science, and social dynamics. Yet even today, the phenomenon retains an air of mystery, resisting a single definitive explanation. One of the leading modern interpretations is that the epidemic was a form of mass psychogenic illness. Known in contemporary research as a type of collective stress-induced disorder, mass psychogenic illness occurs when symptoms such as dizziness, fainting, or nausea spread rapidly through groups without an identifiable pathogen. London in 1919 was a city ripe for such a condition. Traumatized by war, exhausted by the influenza pandemic, and living under economic and social pressures, the population's nervous systems were already primed for overreaction. In this context, the whistle could serve as a psychological trigger, a sound, or the mere expectation of it, that precipitated real physical symptoms. Neuroscience offers additional insights. Modern researchers suggest that auditory hallucinations and phantom sounds can emerge from neurological responses to stress, fatigue, or sensory deprivation. The whistle reported in London may not have existed as an external stimulus at all. Instead, it could have been generated internally by overtaxed auditory pathways and brain regions associated with fear response. In crowded, foggy, and noisy environments, the brain can misinterpret signals, creating the perception of sound where none exists. This could explain why individuals in different locations reported hearing the same whistle simultaneously, a shared psychological response amplified by social suggestion. Environmental factors may also have played a supporting role. London streets in 1919 were filled with fog, soot, and industrial noise. Such conditions can distort auditory perception, creating echoes or high-pitched sounds that seem both real and untraceable. Narrow alleys, tenement courtyards, and densely packed factories may have amplified these effects, particularly for individuals already under psychological stress. While modern acoustics cannot confirm the exact conditions of post-war London, it is plausible that ordinary environmental noises were misinterpreted as something ominous, further feeding the epidemic spread. Historical context is equally important. The whistling epidemic occurred at a moment when the city was collectively traumatized. Returning soldiers suffered from shell shock, families mourned the dead, and the influenza pandemic had left survivors physically weakened and psychologically scarred. The epidemic can thus be seen as a convergence of multiple stresses: neurological vulnerability, psychological tension, and social contagion. Modern theories often emphasize this combination, framing the whistle as a psychosocial phenomenon that exploited the unique conditions of post-war London. Some researchers have proposed more speculative explanations. A few suggest that low-frequency sounds, industrial vibrations, or even early sonic experiments might have inadvertently contributed to the phenomenon. While no hard evidence supports the notion of deliberate manipulation or secret experiments, the idea underscores how mystery and fear often intertwine in the human imagination. Even the mere suggestion of a hidden cause can amplify symptoms in a psychologically primed population, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Comparative studies of similar events worldwide also provide insight. Epidemics of mass psychogenic illness, often triggered by stress or social tension, have occurred in schools, workplaces, and entire communities. In these cases, shared belief in a threat, real or imagined, can produce genuine physiological responses. Fainting spells, dizziness, and panic are not imagined. They are real reactions to perceived danger. The whistling epidemic fits this pattern remarkably well, suggesting that what appeared inexplicable in 1919 may, in fact, be an extreme illustration of a psychological principle that continues to manifest in different forms even today. Modern psychiatry also offers a framework for understanding the sensory and hallucinatory components reported during the epidemic. Auditory hallucinations are not uncommon under extreme stress or trauma, and individuals with heightened anxiety are particularly susceptible. In 1919 London, both children and adults experienced ongoing fear, environmental stresses, and post-traumatic vulnerability. This context could explain why some witnesses reported shadows, lights, or figures accompanying the whistle. Their minds, overwhelmed by anxiety and anticipation, projected additional sensory experiences that became intertwined with the core auditory perception. Finally, the whistling epidemic serves as a cautionary tale about the power of collective fear. Even in the absence of pathogens, chemicals, or visible threats, the human mind is capable of producing profound physical and psychological effects. Modern perspectives emphasize that the epidemic was likely multifactorial, with stress, environment, neurological sensitivity, and social contagion all playing critical roles. It is a striking example of how perception, expectation, and social dynamics can produce events that feel tangible, terrifying, and inescapable. In revisiting the whistling epidemic through the lens of modern science, we gain insight not only into a historical mystery but also into the enduring interplay between mind, body, and society. The phenomenon reminds us that fear itself can become contagious, that perception can shape reality, and that human experience is often more complex than our instruments and observations can fully capture. While the whistle may never have had a definitive source, its echoes continue to resonate in the study of collective psychology, neurological phenomena, and the vulnerabilities of urban populations under stress. As abruptly as it had appeared, the whistling epidemic began to fade from the streets of London. By late 1919, reports of fainting spells and auditory disturbances had decreased significantly. Hospitals saw fewer new cases, and neighborhoods once gripped by fear began to regain a sense of normalcy. Yet, while the physical manifestation subsided, the psychological and social imprint of the epidemic lingered for years, leaving a lasting mark on both the city and the emerging field of psychological and neurological medicine. The decline of the epidemic remains somewhat mysterious. There was no known cure, no environmental intervention, and no coordinated treatment that can be definitively linked to the reduction in cases. Historians and researchers suggest several contributing factors. First, the novelty and fear surrounding the whistle gradually diminished. As people grew accustomed to the idea that the sound might strike anywhere, its power to provoke immediate panic weakened. In the absence of constant alarm, social and psychological triggers lost some of their intensity, reducing the frequency and severity of fainting and hallucination episodes. Second, the epidemic may have naturally run its course due to a psychological saturation effect. Once entire neighborhoods had been affected and studied, individuals may have developed a form of desensitization. The human mind, when repeatedly exposed to a feared stimulus, can sometimes adapt, dampening the physical and emotional reactions over time. In this sense, the decline was less about external intervention and more about the population adjusting to the invisible threat that had dominated their perception for months. Hospitals and medical authorities continued to monitor isolated cases even after the epidemic's apparent end. While fewer incidents were reported, some individuals remain highly sensitive, experiencing fainting or panic when exposed to certain sounds or situations reminiscent of the original episodes. These lingering effects were particularly evident among children and those who had experienced severe early episodes, suggesting that while the epidemic itself had waned, its psychological impact could be long-lasting. The social consequences of the epidemic were also significant. Communities that had been affected developed heightened awareness of stress, fear, and collective behavior. Families reported a newfound caution regarding unexplained phenomena, and social rituals, like keeping children indoors or avoiding crowded streets during periods of high anxiety, became more common. The epidemic highlighted the delicate balance between individual perception and societal influence, demonstrating that fear could spread faster than any physical pathogen. From a medical perspective, the whistling epidemic became an important case study in mass psychogenic illness. Doctors and researchers documented symptoms, social patterns, and environmental conditions in unprecedented detail, creating a foundation for understanding how psychological, social, and environmental factors interact to produce real physical manifestations. Although the phenomenon defied full explanation at the time, these records provided critical insight into collective stress responses, auditory hallucinations, and the complex interplay between mind and body. Psychologists later revisited the case as an early example of how trauma, social contagion, and environmental stress can converge to create mass episodes of illness. The whistling epidemic underscored the importance of considering psychological factors alongside physical symptoms, a perspective that would influence the development of modern psychosomatic medicine. Researchers studying similar outbreaks in schools, workplaces, and communities often cite London's 1919 experience as a benchmark for understanding how collective anxiety can produce real, measurable effects on health. Culturally, the epidemic left a lasting impression on London's collective memory. Stories of fainting workers, collapsing classrooms, and eerie whistling that seemed to follow people through foggy streets became part of local folklore. Newspapers continued to reference the events for years, often framing them as cautionary tales about fear, perception, and the fragility of the human mind. Even generations later, oral histories captured the lingering unease, illustrating how deeply a psychological phenomenon can embed itself in social consciousness. The epidemic also contributed to a broader understanding of the role of environmental and social stress in shaping human behavior. Urban centers like London, with dense populations, industrial activity, and post-war trauma, were particularly susceptible to mass psychological responses. The whistling epidemic highlighted how these factors could combine, producing events that defy simple categorization as either medical or social in origin. This realization has informed modern urban planning, public health policy, and emergency preparedness, emphasizing the importance of considering both psychological and environmental dimensions when managing crises. In retrospect, the whistling epidemic stands as both a historical curiosity and a profound case study in human perception and social dynamics. While the fainting, hallucinations, and terror it caused have long since subsided, the lessons remain relevant. It demonstrated how fear can spread faster than disease, how the mind can generate real physical effects in response to intangible threats, and how society as a whole can be reshaped by collective experience. London survived the epidemic, but its echoes persist in medical literature, psychological research, and the lingering fascination with unexplained events in urban history. Ultimately, the whistling epidemic reminds us that human experience is shaped not only by observable threats but also by perception, anticipation, and social dynamics. Its decline did not erase its legacy. Instead, it transformed into a silent teacher, offering insight into the intricate interplay between mind, body, and society. The events of 1919 may never be fully explained, but their impact continues to resonate, echoing through history as a testament to the enduring power of fear, perception, and the mysteries that linger just beyond our understanding. The strange epidemic that swept across London in 1919 remains one of history's most elusive medical and social puzzles. Unlike outbreaks driven by bacteria or viruses, this one left behind no cultures, no identifiable biological agent, and no clear transmission pathway. What it did leave was something far more unsettling, the undeniable proof that human perception, fear, and social connection can be just as powerful, and just as dangerous, as any physical disease. When we look back at the so-called whistling epidemic, it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the boundary between mind and body. People did not simply imagine their collapses, hallucinations, or fainting spells. Their symptoms were real, measurable, and in many cases debilitating. Yet, they were also triggered not by poison or infection, but by something intangible, a sound, a rumor, a collective fixation that spread faster than any pathogen. It reminds us that the human nervous system is highly sensitive, capable of translating stress, fear, or expectation into very real physical responses. This case also teaches us about the role of environment in shaping our experiences. London in 1919 was not an ordinary city. It was a city emerging from a shadow of World War I, grappling with grief, trauma, and an influenza pandemic that had claimed millions of lives worldwide. Factories filled the air with noise, soot, and vibrations. Streets were crowded, public trust in authorities was shaken, and the population was still nursing wounds both physical and emotional. Against such a backdrop, it is not surprising that something as small as a whistle could evolve into the trigger for a full-scale psychological and physiological event. At the same time, the epidemic illustrates how collective psychology functions much like an infection. A rumor whispered in one part of the city became a headline in the press, and before long, it was a shared fear across neighborhoods. Children heard the stories from parents. Factory workers repeated them to colleagues. Entire communities primed themselves for the moment they too might hear the sound. And once primed, the human brain has a remarkable capacity to turn expectation into reality, whether through hallucination, dizziness, or collapse. In this way, fear became contagious, leaping from person to person without any physical pathogen. Medical history often focuses on the victories of science: vaccines, antibiotics, surgeries that transform what was once fatal into the survivable. But the whistling epidemic reminds us that medicine must also contend with mysteries that defy the microscope and the scalpel. It challenges the assumption that all illness can be traced back to germs or genetics. Sometimes, illness is born from perception, culture, and the fragile threads that bind societies together. To dismiss such events as hysteria or overreaction is to miss the deeper lesson, that our minds are not separate from our bodies, but integral to them. There is also a lesson here for modern times. Today, we live in an age where information travels instantaneously. Rumors, fears, and warnings can reach millions of people in seconds through social media and digital networks. Just as a whistle in 1919 could ripple through the foggy streets of London, today a single video or post can ignite fear across the globe. We have seen how panic buying, health scares, and misinformation can create real, measurable effects on society. The story of 1919 is therefore not a relic of the past. It is a warning of what collective fear can still do when left unchecked. Yet, there is also something deeply human in this story. The people of London were not weak or irrational. They were survivors of unimaginable trauma, living in a city still healing from war and disease. Their minds and bodies reacted in ways that reflected both their environment and their collective scars. To study their experience is not to ridicule them, but to better understand ourselves. Because in truth, we are not so different. Under the right conditions, stress, uncertainty, fear, we too could fall prey to forces that seem invisible, inexplicable, and unstoppable. In the end, the whistling epidemic remains a mystery not because we lack the intelligence to explain it, but because it sits at the crossroads of so many forces: psychology, neurology, sociology, and history. Each discipline offers part of the answer, but none alone can solve the riddle. Perhaps that is why the story continues to fascinate. It resists easy classification. It reminds us that the human condition is layered, complex, and sometimes beyond the reach of tidy explanations. As the streets of London eventually fell silent, the memory of the whistle lingered. For those who experienced it, the sound became a ghost, an echo of a time when the city itself seemed to tremble with invisible menace. For medicine, it became a case study in the fragility of human perception. And for us, a century later, it stands as a story worth retelling, not just as a curiosity of the past, but as a mirror reflecting our own vulnerabilities in the present. The epidemic that whistled in the streets was not carried in the blood, nor passed through the air. It lived in the mind, in the stories, and in the spaces between people. And that, perhaps, is what makes it so haunting. Because if fear itself can act like a disease, if sound and suggestion can topple the strongest among us, then we are reminded that the greatest mysteries in medicine are not always microscopic. Sometimes, they echo through the very fabric of society, as invisible and unforgettable as the whistle that once haunted London streets.